Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Neil Gardner, who we're going to talk about regional banks and IT. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me.
So Neil, you serve as an advisor to CIOs at regional banks. Let's start just with, what does a CIO at a regional bank do? What's that person's remit, mandate, area of responsibility?
So typically, just to get the definition right, CIO, I'm talking about Chief Information Officer. You know, some financial services talk about CIO as Chief Investment Officer, but I'm really talking about the information technology side. So Chief Information Officer. The CIO is typically responsible for all of the functions of IT in a bank, and that typically is responsible for probably 10% of revenue that a typical bank spends on IT.
Wait, so a bank spends 10% of its revenue on IT?
Very typically, yeah. Most financial services companies spend anywhere in between 7 and 10% of their revenue on IT. So it's a very big expense, much bigger than a lot of other industries.
Well, I guess that makes sense. I mean, most of what they're doing is moving information around. So talk to me a little bit about kind of the areas under the CIO, under the Chief Information Officer. What are the major different kind of categories of spend? Or maybe one way to do that is walk me through a typical organization at a regional bank and just maybe give us sort of a size of like how many employees or how much deposits, and kind of then walk us through what does the CIO's organization look like?
Sure. So a regional bank would typically be defined by assets under management. So not revenue, but assets under management. And there is obviously a tie between those two. But assets under management, regional banks will typically be from 5 billion all the way up to 200 billion in assets under management. So there's a pretty wide variety of sizes. And you can very roughly essentially say for every billion in assets under management, a bank will have roughly 100 employees. So if you look at your local bank with, you know, they'll have $1 billion in assets, they probably have a total of 100 employees. That's not just IT, that's total employees. So if you take a regional bank that has, 5 billion in assets, then that's going to be roughly 500 people total. And they're probably going to have an IT organization, roughly in the range of let's say 30 to 60 people. So that's a fairly small organization. On the other hand, if you go all the way up to some of the larger regional banks, so I don't know, a bank, let me just pick an example, a bank like KeyBank, which is, right at the top of the range. I think their assets under management is in between 170 and 200 billion. They have a total of 18,000 employees, and their IT staff is probably pushing 1,000 people or more. So within those organizations, so it's obviously a very wide range of the size of the IT organization within a bank, but the structures are going to be very, very traditional. So they're going to have an operations function, which is obviously going to include things like infrastructure and daily operations. Then they'll have some part of their organization that's dedicated to development and testing. They'll have a part of the organization that's worried about data. And then they'll have probably a small piece of the organization that's focused on software architecture.
Okay. I would like you to walk me through some of these terms. So within operations, and I know some of this might be totally obvious to a listener who knows all about IT, but for me, walk me through, what does infrastructure mean for under operations? What's that include?
Sure. So infrastructure is literally, it used to be traditionally, it was the data center. So, a bank is going to they have to run all of their IT on some sort of server infrastructure. So some sort of hardware. And traditionally, and in some cases still the case, the infrastructure means, all of the data center footprint that they use to run their infrastructure. What's happening today in the modern world is that more and more companies are getting out of the data center business and employing things like AWS, Amazon Web Services, or the public cloud to run their infrastructure, which means they're hosting their actual servers at another company. but those still have to be managed and maintained. And so the infrastructure organization is literally the organization that's responsible for maintaining the software that runs on those servers, the operating systems, making sure that the data is secure, that security policies are in place, things like that.
Okay. And what's the title of the person who runs the operations organization and the infrastructure organization?
It would typically be VP of operations.
Okay.
Or, if it's large enough, they'll have a VP of operations and a VP of infrastructure, but that's a very traditional title.
Okay. And then the next group was development and testing. Talk to me about that a bit. Like, what sorts of applications would the bank be developing? Or just maybe give me almost an overview of what are the different categories of applications that a regional bank needs.
Sure. So the types of applications are, the best way to think about it is if you're thinking about banking from a consumer's perspective, think about how we use a bank. So we have, we'll typically log onto a bank through either a mobile application or through the web. And then we're going to be managing our deposits. We're going to be transferring money around. We might be paying bills. So each of that is part of the software infrastructure. The way that banks typically look at things is they have something called a core banking application, which is really the application that is responsible for managing deposits, keeping accounts separate, understanding kind of like who has what in terms of assets. And then they'll have systems to manage lending. They'll have systems to manage customers, so almost like a CRM system in some cases. And then they'll be responsible for specific applications. So the mobile application that you use to access your bank is software that is the responsibility of the IT department of a banking organization.
And then I imagine that they have specialized applications for mortgages or for other types of loans or for, you tell me.
Absolutely, yes. So a lot of the times today, you'll have specialized applications only at the very largest banks. So the largest banks, so outside regional bank side, so if you go to something like Bank of America, they're actually doing all of their development themselves or a lot of development themselves, where a regional bank is much more purchasing and integrating software from other companies. So, so in other words, their core banking system that they're using to manage their basic functions, almost no regional banks are actually writing that from scratch themselves. They're typically buying it from a third party, customizing it, and then maintaining it and integrating it to other parts of the infrastructure.
Are there like 2 or 3 or 4 big software companies that kind of dominate that market? Which ones are they?
Yes, so you'll have companies like Fiserv or FIS, which is a very, very common system for running core banking. You have up-and-coming players like Finextra. I want to be careful not to, endorse any one product, but there are clearly for the basic important banking functions, there are a few companies that dominate the market. What we're seeing today is that I don't know if you've heard, Will, of the term fintech, but obviously these financial technology firms are developing software that are providing a whole lot of capabilities to regional banks. And so there's a proliferation of fintechs providing these kind of capabilities. And we probably are familiar with a lot of the larger fintechs. A company like PayPal is a fintech. Venmo is a fintech. So a lot of companies that are in that space have grown up to be, common household products.
Okay. So after the category of development and testing, what was the next big category of the organization?
So probably the next largest category is data, and that's really the idea that banks maintain a tremendous amount of data about their customers. There's tremendous value in that data. And so both having good quality data, so, knowing when you're a banking customer, having an accurate view in terms of what's your address, what's your proper name, all of the key information that identifies you as the customer, and then all sorts of other information that actually forms part of the record of you as a customer, that data both needs to be maintained, and then it has a tremendous amount of value in terms of insight that banks can apply to actually better serve their customers. So if a bank, if you're using a credit card through your bank and they see you buying, a whole lot of baby products on the credit card, then there's information there that they can actually use to actually better serve you.
Got it. And was there a fourth group after data?
The last group is architecture, and that is really typically a very small group that is responsible for kind of like thinking about how all this ties together. What are the standards for software development? What are the typical products that at a larger bank everybody has to use? So architecture is typically focused on kind of like standards and how things all hold together.
And what about security? Is that like a separate role from the CIO, or?
Security. So it depends on the bank. There are both security and regulatory are very, very big parts of banking responsibilities. In some cases, you will have a chief information security officer that is separate from the CIO, and this is because of separation of responsibilities. So you want to make sure that there is one person that's responsible and worried only about security. So at any larger bank, you will have a separate chief information security officer and chief information officer. At a smaller regional bank, the CIO will wear both hats.
Okay. So that's a great overview for me. Tell me a little bit about your practice. I think you work on helping kind of drive transformations or more digitization, but tell me a little bit about the work that you do as a CIO advisor to regional banks.
Sure. So what I typically see, or what I very frequently see as I work with my clients, is that there is a basic disconnect between the businesses running the bank and the IT departments that are run by the CIO, and that the IT department is typically viewed just as a cost center. It's something that banks spend a lot of money on, as we talked about earlier, but there's this concern by the business that they're not getting a lot of value for the money that they spend. And so what I am really focused on is turning this view of the IT department from that of a cost center to an organization that is actually creating business value.
Okay, so can you give me an example of that to help illustrate it? Maybe a case example?
So the typical way that you'll see organizations interact is you will have the business makes a whole bunch of requests of the IT department. The IT department is typically feeling like they don't have enough resources to fulfill all those requests. They implement some sort of process to actually prioritize the requests. They put them into a big queue. They work as quickly as they can, and they deliver these projects. This is the traditional way, but this is actually not actually driving business value. And so the transformation that we're looking to affect, or that I'm looking to affect, is actually breaking down the walls between business and IT, and have IT directly involved in business priorities, in the business actually being very, very tightly involved in terms of setting up exactly what IT is going to be doing almost on a week-to-week basis, and having IT directly involved in product development, so that IT is tied to the revenue of the bank, that IT is actually tightly integrated into the product development capability of a bank. So when it works well, do you want me to give you kind of like a case study or an example, Will?
Yeah, let's definitely do that.
Sure. So an example of, I actually can give you an example of where it worked well and an example of where it didn't work well. So, one example of where it worked well is had a client that had an idea for a new advice product, and they had this idea almost initially sketched out on the back of a napkin, and they wanted to get to a product out in the market as quickly as possible. And that involved completely changing the way they worked with their IT department. So we worked with them in terms of completely breaking down the structures between business and IT, literally to the point of getting them co-locating, sitting in the same office space. This was pre-pandemic when people were still in offices. So having people co-located, sitting in the same offices, and they completely changed the way they work together, where there was no business organization and IT organization. There was just one organization working towards the goal of rolling this product out. And they went from design to prototyping to product development to actually rolling it out to the market in something under a year, which is for product development companies, for software product development companies, pretty spectacular. And they did that by completely changing the way that they work together. So the way that they set priorities, the way that they manage their week-to-week work, the way that they made kind of like decisions on what went into the product, the way they actually developed software, all of that was changed. In the end, we actually, I think, changed the complete culture of the organization so that they stopped thinking of business and IT as competing organizations that were fighting for resources, and they moved to an organization that is working together to actually move product to the market.
Well, that sounds like a great outcome. Can you walk me through a little bit of what the journey was like to get from the original state to that more integrated, co-located, kumbaya state where they were all working together?
It was a kumbaya result. It was wonderful to see what can be accomplished, because morale went sky high in the organization, and they really felt like the results were pretty dramatic. So the way that the specific steps that we worked on are actually, let me take a step back. Well, let me talk about kind of like fundamentally how you do this type of thing. If you think about organizational capabilities, you have work that is actually specifically going into let's say business value creation. So work, in this case, it was actually developing this product that was going to be rolled out to the market. And then there are capabilities that I would call foundational capabilities. So that is kind of like all of the organizational capabilities that have to be in place for you to actually do this type of work in 11 months. What we did with this client is we actually worked on these simultaneously. So some specifics are, we actually moved their development process from kind of like a combination of requirements-based and agile development techniques to a full agile development capability. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds of agile, but agile, when done right, is a much more modern way of developing software. And so we actually changed the way that they developed software while they were working on this product. We completely changed the way that the business and IT were making decisions together. So we went to, very regular sessions where they were actually looking at the product as it was being developed. They were doing demos that were, in some cases, very, very, let's say, rough, because you had a very, very early product. But you had both the business and the IT organizations looking at things at the same time, demoing things. The IT organization was getting feedback on a real-time basis, basically every 2 weeks as the product was being developed, so that they could actually react very quickly to the feedback they were getting from the business people who really knew what they wanted in the product. That's a very different way of the typical software and product development methodology that a lot of companies use. The typical way is, the business writes down a whole lot of requirements, IT goes away for 6 months, they do a lot of work, and then they show what they hope is a finished product to the business side 6 months later, and they usually, quite frankly, miss the mark. And so getting this kind of like this bi-weekly cadence where you're actually seeing things as they develop is a very, very effective way of actually moving a lot faster and getting the product right off the bat. So we changed the way the business and IT were looking at the product. We changed the way they were making product decisions. We changed the way that the organization was actually developing and testing software. And we actually worked very closely with the leadership of the company to change the culture so that people were open to the idea of, speaking up about problems as they happened, as opposed to, always just trying to, report good news up to the leadership.
Now, can you make it tactical for me and give me any examples that come to mind of something that, they show at one of these bi-weekly demos and that the business said, no, that's not what we need. We want this other thing instead, where in a traditional way, they would have waited 6 months to find that out. But can you give me an example of one of those sort of feedback and what they noticed early on?
Sure. So let me actually answer that from a little bit of a different perspective. What we saw when they started this process, so a few months into this, into this effort, and product was starting to be developed, and we scheduled these product demos, which were, essentially the people both from the business and IT were showing the current state of the product to the leadership to get feedback. And the first few times that this happened, the demos were, let's say, very near perfect. They were slick. Everybody was prepared. Everything looked very nice. Leadership looked at it and said, "Oh yeah, that looks really nice." And what we found out as we kept working with this, because in fact, this is actually demos that work perfectly are a warning sign to me, because it means that people are doing too much preparation for a demonstration. And so we worked very, we coached the team, and we saw that they were actually trying too hard to make things be perfect when they showed their leadership, as opposed to showing them as they were. Mm-hmm. And so as we actually changed the way people worked, what used to happen is they would show the product. So for example, just to give you a specific example, they would show a product where, a customer was coming in and the customer would sign up, and they would have, literally, you think about it on your computer, you have a web form where the customer is signing up for a specific product. And they were developing that sign up form. And as they would show that to the business would say, "You know what? This is really hard to understand. I don't understand what this particular field means. You're asking for information that the customer isn't going to have." And so this type of feedback that an IT organization would have no way of knowing, since they don't actually work directly with the customers on a day-to-day basis. So that's literally the type of things that would come out in a demonstration. Tiny things like the information that was being asked, or the way it was being asked for, the way it was being explained, the validation that was done on a particular field. That type of feedback, which is very, it sounds very minor, but if you've ever used a product that was, asking you for information that you didn't have, can be very, very frustrating from a customer's perspective. So that kind of feedback is incredibly valuable as you're developing a product.
You got it. Let's go back to this broader issue of how the IT organization can be thought of as a profit center or value creation center, not just a cost center. What are some other ways that that the IT organization can actually generate value for the organization?
So, I think that there is a couple things that I look for, or that I try to push organizations towards. The first is that the IT organization's metrics, the way they measure themselves, their KPIs, have to be tied to the business strategy. And that's actually amazingly quite rare. That most IT organizations have a bunch of KPIs that, when you look at them, are fairly disconnected. They're around things like efficiency and availability, and things that are important but are not actually directly tied to what's driving the business. So driving revenue, driving customer engagement, driving customer satisfaction. And so, IT organizations that actually start to measure themselves in terms of what's driving the business is one thing that's really important. The other thing that I look for, or that I try to push organizations towards, is things around innovation. So the IT organization has to move from being an order taker, taking, asking their business partners, what do you want, to actually engaging directly in terms of what is the right thing to do for our product, how do we innovate. We have knowledge about, data and systems that the business doesn't have, and there are innovative opportunities that could be there for product development that IT should be able to be developing, not just relying on the business to come up with all the new product ideas.
Can you give me some examples of the metrics of a IT organization that are well aligned with the business strategy? What would examples of some metrics be?
So they're going to be looking for things like, probably the best way to describe it is time to value. So measuring from the time that the business has an idea to change something that's going to impact a customer to when that actually is rolled out and actually is productized in the field. So that's an example. So time to value is a great example of measuring how quickly you actually go from idea to product. Other examples are things like customer retention, as I mentioned, customer satisfaction. So measuring those types of things and making the IT organization responsible for them is an example of metrics that are actually tied not just to the functioning of IT, but actually to the functioning of the business.
What are some of the kind of cool IT related innovations that you see regional banks doing? Like what are some of the applications they have under development or that have recently been launched that are, getting that customers seem to like?
It's an interesting challenge for the regional banks because they're actually under a tremendous amount of pressure, both from the development, the investment that the very large banks are making into their products, and the attempt to disaggregate them from some of the fintechs. So a great example of this is, I'm a Venmo customer, and literally before we were about to talk, Will, I got an email from Venmo offering me a credit card. Typically, it used to be, that credit cards always came from banks, and Venmo's not a bank. Venmo is, they do payments, but they're not they're really not a deposit regulated bank. On the other hand, Venmo offers me a credit card. So regional banks are under a lot of pressure, both from below and from on top. And so the innovations that I'm seeing at the regional banks that are really meeting this challenge are really around expanding the products that banks are offering to their customers. So if you think about the traditional bank was all organized around the deposit account, whether it's a business, whether it's a commercial relationship or a B2C relationship. The traditional bank, they worried about, how much money you have in the bank, and then they make their revenue from lending that money out. That's the traditional business model. The newer business models are all around adding services that are not really tied to deposits. So for example, something that most banks now have are bill pay. But, if you think about it, even 10 or 15 years ago, you didn't used to pay bills through your bank. You used to write checks. So not quite the same thing. Then there's innovation around credit score management, offering advice, aggregating more of a customer's financial picture into one screen. So if you think about, very few people have all of their money in one bank or one asset manager. They typically have it distributed around multiple institutions. Being able to get one view of that is a classic service that customers are asking for. And then I'm also starting to see banks even go farther than that and start to look at things like budgets, like as in household budgets and goal setting. So helping their customers with things that are outside of the traditional kind of like deposit management and really starting to get more deeply involved with helping their customers, I guess, manage their finances in their financial world. So the innovations I'm seeing are developing products or integrating products that actually develop a more complete suite of, I guess, financial services to their customers.
And they're competing to this to some degree with, you said, the different fintech type companies?
Yeah, they're competing with fintechs, and they're competing with large banks. So regional banks, one trend that you're seeing in the industry that has actually opened up again after tailing off during the pandemic is there's a fair amount of consolidation in the industry as regional banks try to get more scale so that they have more resources to do this kind of development. But they're absolutely competing. They're both, it's almost like a co-opetition type thing where they're competing directly with fintech products and also integrating fintech products into their core products that they're offering to their customers so that they actually offer more of those capabilities.
What type of customer chooses to go to a regional bank versus going to a national bank like a Bank of America? What are the advantages that a customer gets from going to a regional bank?
So honestly, Will, I haven't done a ton of research on that space. My perspective is that most customers choose their bank based on their perceived, both product capabilities and customer service. And so it used to be that, people chose their bank based on where the branch network was close because they always wanted to be able to go into a branch. Mm-hmm. That's still a factor, although there is a lot of consolidation of branches. Branches are not going away, but a lot of banks are closing branches. But so clients it's still a factor in their decision in terms of, is there a branch close by? But more and more, customers are choosing banks based on the capabilities and the perceived customer relationship. So you have you have these what are called in the industry neobanks or new banks that are, in most cases, have no branches, are just, are all on the web and are actually being quite successful in acquiring customers just because of the customer experience.
What do you call banks that are smaller than a regional bank? So I think you had the cutoff.
Yeah, a local bank, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think the latest count there are something like 4,500 banks in the United States. So our regulatory environment is such that it encourages quite a large number of smaller banks. So if you think about, when I'm looking at regional banks, there's probably, if I go from 5 billion and up, that's probably a few hundred banks. So the vast majority of banks and credit unions are much smaller than that.
And then the national banks, like how many national banks would you say that there are?
There's probably about, anywhere from 7 to 10. And they're the banks that everybody knows about, so JP Morgan and Bank of America and Citigroup and Wells Fargo. Those are the really, those are the behemoths. And I would say that, if you're looking at above 200 billion in assets under management, that is somewhere around 15 to 20 banks. So the largest national banks, there is, a handful of those.
How do you get discussions with CIOs at regional banks? So you've been at a large firm, you've been in financial services yourself, but how are you doing client development now?
Almost exclusively through networking. So I have some inbound marketing. So I publish, I have a website, I have a blog. Eventually, when there are conferences that are started up again, I will be going to those conferences. But by far, my method of business development is basically relationship based. So I'm very focused on my network and one-to-one conversations. My attitude towards business development is if I have a large number of positive conversations, that's going to drive business.
And one nice thing for you is that your universe is fairly defined. So if there's something like 200 of these regional banks, each one has one CIO. So there's sort of 200 possible clients for you to, you could probably identify all the names of all the potential clients in your universe. And
absolutely. I mean, this was a very conscious decision I made when I started my own practice, which is, prior to running my own practice, I worked in big company consulting and, of course, worked for, a large number of financial services firms, most of them quite large, but also had experience in other industries. And, one of the key decisions I made going out on my own was I needed to really target a niche that is going to help me, become an authority within that niche. And so I picked regional banks primarily because they're big enough. A lot of times when I talk to people and I talk about regional banks, it kind of like it triggers, a Rolodex moment where people say, yeah, you know what, you should talk to so-and-so. And it also is a segment that is actually underserved in that they don't spend enough money to be of tremendous interest to the, let's say the big four or, Bain, BCG, McKinsey. So they are, they're a little underserved. And so, but at the same time, they have a lot of the same problems that the very large banks have. And so that's how I picked that niche.
Fantastic. Well, Neil, if someone listening to the show wants to find out more about your practice or get in touch with you, where would you point them online? And we will include your links in the show notes.
Sure. So my website is NMG Advisory, as in Neil Michael Gardner Advisory. So nmgadvisory.com. And maybe I can give you my LinkedIn profile, and you can put that in the show notes as well.
Sure. We'll include that link in the show notes. Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining. This was a really fantastic tour of the world of information technology at regional banks, and I learned a ton. Thanks so much for joining today.
Will, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.